And so we'll have lectures 4, 5, and 6 today consecutively. And then we can have a short time of question and Q&A, and I'd be happy to have a discussion after that. So the official title of this first lecture is simply Modern Indian Nonfiction. That's a very broad title, but it was really with the idea of reminding us that we are talking not just about fiction and poetry, but also about creative nonfiction, important essays, things like that. That was one impulse. The other is to talk about continuing to talk about some of the foundational writers in Indian national writing or nationalist writing, starting in the 1830s and so forth. So those were the twin impulses. Before I go further, I just want to go over a few terms from post-colonial criticism that I did not have time for yesterday or that I went over very quickly. And I can't say I'm going to explore these in depth today either, but I want us to keep these in mind. First of all, this guides many of the lectures this week. I think one of the key points, and I think you all know this, is that literary criticism in general has taught us is that language is not transparent. Now, that's important, especially with regard to nature writing, because it was presumed, even until fairly recently, that if we describe nature, that's it, right? But as we know, it depends on, first of all, the person's perspective, and secondly, that language mediates everything. So I think we're used to that now as students of literature, but it was not something that was assumed. And so when we read texts, not even so long ago, through the first half of the 20th century, a lot of those writers would assume, including Aldo Leopold, for example, that we can document what we see. It's a more empirical idea. But now we're a little more skeptical of that in a healthy way. So I wanted to mention that. Another term which I did mention, is the idea of cosmopolitanism or metropolitan cultures. The way I mentioned it was that another part of both post-colonial and eco-critical writing that is a challenge is, as I said, most writers are from urban contexts. We are all educated in that. And so how we are already conditioned in some ways to describe nature or subaltern peoples from a particular perspective, right? That's not to say that's wrong. This is not either or situation. It's just that we should keep that in mind, right? So the cosmopolitan viewpoint can be a bit of a privileged viewpoint, right? Where we talk about, and a lot of the first writers, a number of them, not all, are cosmopolitan, right? And so there have been some scholars in the early days of post-colonial critique who saw this as a big problem, right? This was insurmountable. But now we have a more complex understanding that even those critics are cosmopolitan. So it may have to do with how we define that for each context. Two terms I did not introduce that are from the scholar Mary Louise Pratt. She's actually in Spanish and Portuguese studies, are the contact zone and transculturation. The contact zone was a useful way of talking about the colonial context when the Europeans established contact with locals, and all kinds of interesting things happen in that context zone, right? So the Europeans come, mostly males, come with an imperious eye and so forth. But on the other hand, they also are changed by this interaction and engagement with local peoples, vice versa, right? Or conversely, the local individuals will be changed by the contact with the uh, colonizers. Now, this may seem obvious, but I think if you're interested to look more closely at Pratt's discussion, there's a lot of nuances there, right? And we can't write off all colonizing, all European writing is bad, all post-colonial writing is good, obviously. So she makes a more nuanced argument. Just to raise an example that she does not use, but just because I was teaching it in a survey class recently, was you all know the novel Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. That's always a useful one, I think, to think about in that respect, right? You have the complexities that he brilliantly shows of that context zone. And each person is different. And then on top of that, even the colonizers are different, right? They're not all the same. So another large term, I'm sorry I'm throwing all these terms, but I think a lot of you are familiar with a number of them. So you'll also know where I'm coming from, what I have in mind. Is discourse, we've talked about that, colonial discourse, and I said it was institutionalized ideology, if you want another way of describing it. But I think we have to keep in mind what we're going to, I'll come back to this with Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon tomorrow, I believe, which is the colonization of mind, right? So not total colonization, but the psychological aspects were profound insights by especially Fanon, who was trained as a psychiatrist. And we'll talk about that. The other part of this comes from Foucault, as you know, the idea of discourse, which influences Edward Said's Orientalism. So that's obviously another term. I think we're familiar with that. But there is in post-colonialism, and this is a bit theoretical, but there are two thrusts. One is Marxist, right, for material change, but the other is psychoanalytic. And sometimes those critics disagree. But I think those debates are somewhat in the past, it's more or less. I think we've absorbed the lessons that we have to balance these. So if you're interested, someone I'm not going to talk about, I don't have time for, is Jacques Lacan, the idea of language. His insight was language constructs our psyche so much, right? And the mirror stage. So if you're interested, you can look that up. Colonial writing, travel writing, again, this is not a concept, but a genre that also is fascinating to look at when we see, for example, we'll get to this with the Caribbean a little bit, where then the gaze is returned or put reversed, so that we have not the colonized or the post-colonial travel writing returning the gaze onto the Europeans, right? So we'll keep that in mind. So travel writing is important because that already implies a certain mobility that was the privilege until, it's been some time now, but originally was the privilege of the Europeans, males usually, who would go around and describe all these things, right? So keep that in mind. A couple more terms. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, you know about his debate with Achebe on the use of language. So Things Fall Apart, to use the same example, is written in English. In 1958, while Nigeria is still colonized, and Achebe in his essays talks about his colonial education, right? Why is everything, European, right? This is in the 1950s. He wrote the novel at the age of 28, so he certainly was just coming out of that. But he chooses English, right? Because he found, here's the interesting thing that he found, was that this is the paradox of the nation state sometimes. And India, we could relate to this. That Nigeria was made up of many languages, many ethnic groups, two major religions, plus innumerable local folk, as we anthropologists might say, folk religions. So how do you have a Nigerian literature, right? What language are you going to use? If you're going to use Igbo, his language, he makes some interesting remarks that Igbo was oral. It was not written down, even later than a lot of other places. So it was only in the early 1900s, really, that you start to get a standardization of Igbo, which he said is useful and practical, but not good for aesthetic writing. Isn't that fascinating? So he says, I can't write, if I wrote in my local dialect of Igbo, no one else would, it wouldn't go very far. If I use the standard one, it's practical, but it's serviceable, but it's not capturing the ethos, so I have to use English. Whereas Thiongo advocated for using Gikuyu, which is his mother tongue. He did abandon that. He said, I will only write from now on in in Gikuyu, but it was a noble effort, right? And he thought street drama was the way to go. So I mention this debate because if you go back for the Caribbean writers, as we'll see, who are very much conditioned by the environment, right? The Caribbean writers in particular grasp onto the figure of Caliban as a canonical character from Shakespeare's The Tempest, who they then can turn back onto the colonizer. And Caliban famously learns the language of the master, right? But then again, it's not like the exact same language. You shape the language to your own ends. And as I always say, no one owns a language, but I know that's debatable. And no group owns a language. If those are hot debates in the world today. But I think it's useful to keep that in mind. A couple more things. We talked about the subaltern, and I think it's useful to keep in mind Spivak's original essay from a long time, 40 years ago almost. I think it was 40 years ago on, or the late 80s, on Three Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism, in which, for example, she sees Jane Eyre. Do you know Jane Eyre? A lot of us. These canonical texts, right? Victorian texts. You see Bertha Mason as Creole, right? Who is disregarded. That's why it's fun to teach Jane Eyre with White Sargasso Sea, of course, with Jean Rhys's 1966 modernist novel. Because then you get sort of even though Jean Rhys was white, but that's another thing we'll get to about Creole can be cultural or ethnic. It can also be a language. So I mentioned Creole. I just wanted to reiterate this. And then we have, of course, Gauri Viswanathan's thesis from 1989, Masks of Conquest, which says, as I tell my American students, the reason you're studying modern literature is partly due to the British colonization of India, all the ironies of history, right? Because in those days, modern literatures were not deemed worthy of study, serious study. It was only Latin and Greek, and then later Sanskrit or Persian. So it was really, even Matthew Arnold advocated that, right? So it was only later and in India, that the study of modern literatures begins. So I want to keep that in the back of our mind. And finally, obvious point, all of these intersect and overlap and condition our view. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of those, even at the risk of repeating them today. So to get to, and thanks for mentioning modern, what modern means. There are other terms I may use, sometimes assuming too much, right? We have to stipulate our terms. So especially if you write an article or a book, you need to say, how am I using this term, right? So, of course, there are many modernities, but that's another topic. But when I refer to modern in this course, it will be late modernity, really not in the postmodern sense, but mainly when I say late modernity, I mean really starting with the Industrial Revolution. So here's where a number of developments intersect in interesting ways. So, for example, I mentioned how colonialism and imperialism are part of globalization, one and the same, and how that also is part of the modern spread of the modern ideas and condition, for better or worse. Um, and then I was talking with your professor, Dr. Mohan, about a guy named Dussel, who is talks about transmodernity. So there are a lot of, if you're interested, a lot of responses to this idea of what we mean by modern. What I'm, for the purposes of our lectures, I think keep in mind this idea of globalization, the spread of language, and also the paradoxically, this is also the era of print capitalism and what Ben Benedict Anderson calls imagined communities. Now, there's a kind of push-pull dynamic. It's hard to say a chicken and egg thing. Literacy and education both spread, and everyday people become the subjects of artistic works. That's new, right? Mostly in the 19th century. There are some exceptions before that, but generally. The use of colloquial language is another part. So Bankim Chandra, as we'll see, that's a big part of what he does. Now, I'm not a Bangla speaker, but that idea has many writers have found ways to innovatively talk about that. For example, you could go back to Dante, right, 1300, Chaucer, late 1300s, Camões, who's a Portuguese writer, 1570s, and they are using everyday language. They refuse to use like Latin or whatever, right? Now that's a little different because when we get to the late modern time, to continue with modernity, we're talking about the idea of the spread of print, right? Mass production, reaching a lot of people, newspapers. Those early writers did not have that luxury, right? Dante and Chaucer were still in the age before print. So how do you have to copy everything, right? So it stays within a pretty small sphere. Whereas we see what happening in Europe, and then also with Bankim Chandra in India, with the masterly use of Sanskrit at times, but sometimes colloquial Bengali. And you find this true of most of the most writers around the world who are thought of as national writers tend to be ones that use ordinary language because that's what reaches the people. There are some exceptions, but if you keep it too highbrow, it's not going to work. So now the Romantics did that, right? Even though we may think of them as high-flown, remember Wordsworth and Coleridge talk about in 1798 lyrical ballads. That was seen as a contradiction, an oxymoron. How can ballads be lyrical, right? And they said, no, it can be, right? So that's why it's almost like it was scandalous at first, like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's very, it's like a kid's rhyme, but then it's saying a lot of things. So this was something that was, I don't want to say it was picked up. It wasn't just that the Bankim was copying the Europeans, but that maybe it's an instinctive notion that you want to reach larger populace. Now, I just want to point out, and this is all by way of a larger introduction, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities is important, but we know Partha Chatterjee responded to it. What Benedict Anderson said is really important, that a nation, you could be hundreds of kilometers apart, but if you're reading the same newspaper, you can imagine it to be part of a community, right? That seemed, until then, everyone had to see each other, right, pretty much. So, and then this was facilitated by print capitalism. And he says this interesting statement. Ultimately, this fraternity, this idea of seeing common goals, makes it possible over the past 2 centuries, and he's writing in the 1980s, so you're talking um, since the revolutions in America and France. It makes it possible for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willingly to die for such limited imaginings. So that's fascinating that you can, die for that. That's why he talks about the tomb of the unknown soldier. Why unknown? Because it can stand for everyone. But Partha Chatterjee did say, and you'd have to read all this, it's quite sophisticated, but I can't do justice. Uh, he's persuasively shown that while this is useful, it is all European based, even though Manderson worked on Indonesia. And he points out that the anti colonial struggle was already there. We're going to see this as we know, in Gare Bahare, or The Home in the World, right? Which is this idea of the interior space becomes the spiritual domain and the space in which you can inculcate or maybe incubate an anti colonial struggle that you cannot outwardly do under colonialism in public. It still tends to be conditioned by men, but we can talk about that. Um, but anyway, he does say, for example, that it's also the vernacular paintings by Raja Ravi Verma and others, calendar art, all of those things. And there are these one fantastic scholars, and maybe some of you know them, Tanika Sarkar, Suzy Taru, Uma Chowdhury, and many others who write so persuasively about the complexities of this home domesticity and its role in the national imagination. I mention all this because it's an example of how we shouldn't just use European concepts without scrutinizing them. Some of them are great, like Foucault's idea of discourse, right? But Foucault never gave a thought to colonialism either, right? So Edward Said sees that, he uses that in an effective way, but not to use them blindly. So, and there are a growing, by the way, and I'm not as well versed, but a growing development these days is using not just indigenous, but also non-European models of viewing the world, viewing the nation state, and so forth. So, the last thing I wanted to say today, and I know this is taking longer than I thought, but is the term wilderness I mentioned, right? We talked about. I forgot to mention an important writer who wrote some decades ago, actually it was 1995, 30 years ago, William Cronin, who talked about, I love his title, The Trouble with Wilderness. He's an American historian. He's not a literary critic. And the subtitle is, Or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature, in which he describes the history of environmentalism in the US to show that this movement has, remember John Muir and these people, has idealized certain landscapes as untouched by humans. But as he shows, the ideal of wilderness derived from 19th century European notions of the sublime and the sacred. So I don't think I made that connection yesterday, that this idea of the sublime and the sacred from Europe informed John Muir and these Americans, and that in turn, and they become a model, by the way. The idea of the national parks, right, becomes a model for parks around the world. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And this essay, as another noted scholar named Ursula Heise, who works in, I think she's at Stanford or Berkeley, one of those, I can't remember. She notes that this essay prompted a re-examination of established environmental authors as well as a broadening of the canon. So we have to broaden that canon out. Greg Girard also gives us in his book Eco-Criticism, talks about the paradox that on the one hand, we know that humans destroy nature, but I don't know if you've seen, I don't know if in India, I think they have similar ads of the Jeeps and SUVs and all going out into nature, right? So this can go wherever you want to really enjoy nature. So you see the paradox, right? We know that. The selling of wilderness, I guess is what I'm getting at. And we still sell that. We sell retreats. We sell the, like Kaveri Nambison's novel about the Kurg area. I actually went there about 12 years ago to a jungle forest retreat. I'm thinking, this is really strange. I'm paying a lot of money for it. But so this paradox of selling really good ideas, maybe some aspects are good. So, okay, I'll stop there for that. Now, so today I'm going to look at Henry Derozio to start with. And I don't know how many have, I'm just curious, how many have read Derozio? Just a few of you? Yeah. Oh, okay, good, good. Because I think Roshinka Chowdhury has really done a lot to show how these writers are important. This was in, he lived only 22 years, 1809 to 1831. Wrote in English. He was Eurasian, Anglo-Indian, but he was very vigorously and proudly Indian. And he wrote in English. So what I love about some of these writings, we're going to get to the poems later today, but his writings are, remember that this is a colonial context. He can't say there is censorship. So also he's very young, and so is the idea of modern nation in India. So how do you articulate that? Well, not surprisingly, a lot of that is articulated through a romantic imagery of trees, flowers, landscapes. That connects us back to the eco-critical. So Derozio, I'll just read a bit of one of Chowdhury's essays called The Politics of Naming. This was in Modern Asian Studies. The Politics of Naming, Derozio in Two Formative Moments of Literary and Political Discourse, Calcutta, 1825 to 1831. So he's writing from early teen years. He became a teacher as a teenager and in Hindu college. And so she says he used the pseudonym an East Indian for several poems he published in his lifetime, and he may have used it again in a heated controversy that played itself out. So there were these debates that happened in the different journals, the India Gazette. Now this was again modeled on the really interesting debates that were going on in the Edinburgh Review and other things in England. And his editorial, the occasion was an editorial comment upon a community of office goers in the city, or as they were spelled, sirkars, right, SIRCARS, who had set up a literary association. This editorial was widely perceived to be reactionary, and civil society responded vigorously in protest. The sequence of editorials and letters published on this issue, so this shows the debates that are going on as people are thinking, how do we proceed, right? Which seem to have been written by Englishmen, East Indians, and Indians alike, demonstrate a remarkable liberalism of spirit and free-thinking attitude to ethnicity that was soon to disappear in the stiffening boundaries of a racially divided society. So again, we cannot make a monolith of colonialism. It waxes and wanes. The degree to which it is enforced, it's always bad, but the degree to which it is enforced. And I know William Dalrymple has written about this as a historian. 1825 was also the year that Derozio began to publish politically in the poetry columns of newspapers and periodicals in the city. So again, he's 16 years old. By the time he died, in 1831, he had published 2 books of poems and had created a revolution of sorts among the radicalized youth of Hindu college. Wow, 200 years ago. Amazing. From which he had been dismissed for his role in their alienation from tradition. In 1831, a few months before his death, Derozio addressed a mammoth meeting called to commemorate the return of, you don't have to remember this name, John Ricketts, an East Indian representative, from his mission to the Houses of Parliament. Using these two occasions, this is more important, the public correspondence and the meeting, both concerned with the politics of naming. Rusinko says in her essay, will then attempt to present the early radical interventions of the mixed race community, the Eurasians, as they were called then, in initiating a discourse of civic rights and human dignity, which led ultimately to organize attempts at constitutional change and political reform in India, whose estimation is underrated in present day context. So she's, as I said, she's done a lot to show the importance of these. What I also find interesting is that we have people like Derozio, who is kind of in between, right? Sort of they're treated as that. Sometimes favored by the British, but not always, because of their mixed race. And so I think that there's been a lot of research on Anglo-Indians and their literature, but maybe not as much, as Chaudhry says, as what they've contributed to the national debate about what it means to be a nation that encompasses everyone, right? So I think that's important. So that was my little snippet on Derozio. We're going to get to his poems in a few minutes. Also, now we come to Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, his essays, not Anandamath, right? So we'll get to Anandamath, which I might talk a little longer about because I've written about it. But I thought it would be useful to just glance at a few lines of tribute to him by Tagore and Aurobindo Ghosh, right? To show how important they thought of him. Then we can look at just snippets of lines from his work. Now, not all of these lines are directly addressing nature. I don't mean that. But they are part of that larger context. Anandamath is much more clearly so. So what Bankim Chandra, in a poem called Bankim Chandra that Tagore wrote, he said in English, it's been translated recently, we need on our journey torches to keep the darkness of night at bay. Our bedside lamps keep blowing out in the wind. Sterile deeds are destroyed by the cruel march of time. Whatever stagnates is swept away like trash, leaving no trace. Very colloquial, earthy, right? Then I'll skip a few lines. He says, you have fulfilled this prayer, O Bankim. The boon that time has entrusted to your hands is not lifeless or inert. The stream of new literature bursting forth at your magic touch, interesting, wakes with its ceaseless flow new life here in the mind of Bengal. A few lines further. This is your surging, echoing message today, Bankim. This is the stream on which your name and achievements ride. Again, loosely naturalistic, the stream, not specifically, but loosely naturalistic. Very much Tagore's style. And so, sure of your survival, I join the muse of Bengal in singing your praise. I'll say a little more about some of these terms as we go along. Sri Aurobindo he wrote an essay as a tribute. These were collected in an anthology. He called him Rishi Bankim Chandra. There are many who, lamenting the bygone glories of the great and ancient nation, speak as if the rishis of old, the inspired creators of thought and civilization, were a miracle of our heroic age, not to be repeated among degenerate men and in our distressful present. Interesting term, in our distressful present. Aurobindo is writing late 1800s, but mostly into the early 1900s, right? And very much part of that, a counterpart, kind of going alongside the beginnings of the Gandhian movement, say in 1915 and so forth. So, and he says, just let me read one more line. Among the rishis of the later age, we have at last realized that we must include the name of the man who gave us the reviving mantra, which is creating a new India, the mantra Vande Mataram. Now, I will talk about that song too, which I know is an important one. So, coming from Bankim. Um, so it's interesting that they feel the need. This was in the early, maybe 100 years ago, let's say. They felt the need to champion Bankim Chandra, right? Whereas I think one reason perhaps is that he was more read in Bengal, despite the song kind of became detached from the novel, than he was in other parts of India. Where Sri Aurobindo, of course, went to ultimately to Puducherry, right, and so forth. So, and Tagore traveled the world. So I think that was their impetus. This is an interesting statement to give us this context, where Aurobindo says, no nation can grow without finding a fit and satisfying medium of expression for the new self, right? That talks about language, talks about modernity, into which it is developing. Without a language which shall, he doesn't mean necessarily one literal language, he means a kind of expressive force. Without a language which shall give permanent shape to its thoughts and feelings and carry every new impulse swiftly and triumphantly into the consciousness of all. It was Bankim's first great service to India that he gave the race which stood in its vanguard such a perfect and satisfying medium. He was blamed for corrupting the purity of the Bengali tongue. So here we get this concept of purity, messiness, but more importantly, I just wish to show, and again, this is my modest, contribution. I'm not an expert on these writers. To show the ways in which they themselves saw themselves as modern, and trying to negotiate, trying to say, we need to have an Indian modernity, rightfully so, right? And all nations would do that in different ways. So, yeah, okay. Let me skip now down. There's also the idea that Aurobindo loved from Bankim Chandra, which is the idea of mother, maternal mother India, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. He says, let me just read this last bit from Aurobindo. It is not till the motherland reveals herself to the eye of the mind as something more than a stretch of earth or mass of individuals. It is not till she takes shape as a great divine, capital D, and maternal power in a form of beauty that can dominate the mind and seize the heart, that these petty fears and hopes vanish in the all-absorbing passion for the mother and its service, and the patriotism that works miracles and saves a doomed nation. It is not in this that it is born, he's saying, right? And it's interesting that Aurobindo would, this is a footnote, it's interesting that he so much so, he pushes the idea of the maternal, that he then, of course, identifies the mother in the Aurobindo ashram as sort of the beacon, who was not Indian. That's another story, right? We could talk about. My insight here, my thought, and again, I'm modest contribution, is that we have this classic paradox in post-colonial thinking, but any nation, which is that on the one hand, we are tied to this particular geography, to particular soil. But on the other hand, we also want to transcend that, because not everyone's in the same soil. So if you're in Bengal, that's very different from Tamil Nadu, right? So how are you going to connect those? That's the challenge. America's a bit unique and kind of wild west. The American idea is tends to be a little less rooted, even though they claim they are, because of course they were a settler nation. And you can find the same sentiments in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand a little bit, because there are the indigenous people we talked about who claim the land. So that's very complex. So what does Bankim Chandra say? I better hurry up here. let me just read one snippet and then I'll close. This is because I'm going to get to Anandamat. He says, we Bengalis are strangely apt to forget that it is only through the Bengali only through Bengali that the people can be moved. We preach in English and harangue in English and write in English, perfectly forgetful that the great masses whom it is absolutely necessary to move in order to carry out any project of social reform remain stone deaf to all our eloquence. Right? Very aware of this, right? Not a new situation, but especially, I think, challenging in a multilingual. Remember, I mentioned Nigeria, which Achebe talks about. That's the challenge, right? And so he's very attuned to this, and I think we could say a lot more about this. Okay, let me skip ahead. Where are we in time? Let me just check my. Okay, so I think we still have time for this, and yeah. Okay, so he also says this is interesting, where Bunkim is writing. These are from an anthology, as I said, and so they're taken out of context from different essays. He wrote a lot of newspaper columns, as you know. Some of you know more than I do about this. He says English civilization has, and he was writing in English and Bengali. So English civilization has pulled down the 330 million deities of Hinduism and set up in the total space once occupied by them its own tutelary deities, comfort, and his brother, respectability. He's always a bit coy and sometimes sardonic. He's very good at that. What I wanted to, maybe the takeaway, as we like to say, what do we take away from this, is, from my readings anyway, of scholars of Bunkim, like Tapan Ray Chaudhary or Partha Chatterjee, of course, and many others, Tanika Sarkar, is that he was interesting, but I think a classic situation of a modern individual in the 1800s who wants, on the one hand, rightly, understandably, to maintain something of the Indian, authentic Indian ethos, and its legends, the Puranas, and all these things. At the same time, he wants to historicize and use some of the science, the empiricism that he saw as valuable, as a valuable contribution of the British. So, for example, he famously wrote a long essay in which he wanted to historicize Krishna, right? So that's interesting, right? That was a big debate at the time, apparently, because he wants to, in the same way that maybe the Europeans had historicized Christ, or, this idea. In fact, George Eliot, the famous Victorian writer, translated from German a book about the historical Christ. She was an atheist, but she translated it. And the idea was not, their idea was not, in Europe, was not so much religious as to say, well, what is the role of history in this, right? So what Bunkim does is this is his nonfiction side, right? This is his maybe non-poetic side, is he has this very analytical mind that says, we have to, if we're going to be a modern nation, we have to find ways to historicize our past. That's his argument, right? It's not that everyone agreed with it, right? So I think that's one of the takeaways here. But he did say, he famously mentioned that you must keep up a critical spirit, as he said, a critical spirit. He's not saying, I think he was always willing to learn. He had some big blind spots, as we'll know, with certain respect to religion, but certainly he was a complex individual who's, like a lot of complex thinkers, one part of their writing may contradict another, right? So, okay, let me go to briefly to Ramesh Chandra Dutt, who another interesting person who what he does, a lot of like Michael Madhusudan Dutt and Ramesh Chandar and a lot of writers, even Ram Mohan Roy, they would separate their poetry, or especially with Dutt, right, and Michael Madhusudan Dutt, they would separate their poetic or creative work from their analytic. So Dutt was actually a history of economics. He was an economist, very well trained. So he wrote a history of the economics of India from way back, right? But he felt you had to keep that separate from the sort of poetic. So he translated works into Bengali and vice versa. Whereas Bunkim said, I don't have to separate that, right? So sometimes he would not. But here's what he said. He was an Indian civil servant, of course, translated the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the literature of Bengal. Very compendious volume. He was the first major economist to argue for what was later recognized as true, which is that for centuries, so he was the first one to write about this, until the advent of British rule in 1757, India was one of the world's great manufacturing and agricultural regions, because British colonialism had subdued that memory, and that the British East India Company discouraged Indian manufacturers in the early years of British rule in order to encourage the rising manufacturers of England. That becomes common knowledge later, but not at the time he wrote this, right? In the 1880s and so forth. Or he did the empirical research. So we might look at a book from a work, and this is where it fits in with literature, from his massive 1891 work, A History of Civilization in India based on Sanskrit literature, which ranges from the Vedic period to 1194. Wow, that's ambitious, right? I can't imagine that. And he doesn't even get up to the very far, 1894. He opens the chapter of Ashoka the Great. I haven't read the whole book, so I'm just snippets. Ashoka the Great and his edicts. And he wrote it in English. So he says, the Buddhist period begins with the brilliant reign of Ashoka the Great. No greater prince has ever reigned in India since the Aryans first colonized this country, and no succeeding monarch equaled his glory, if we only accept Vikramaditya of the 6th century and the great Akbar of the 16th century. But the claims of Ashoka to greatness rest less on the extent of his empire and his prowess, so this is an important point, than on the liberal and Catholic, small c, spirit which inspired his internal administration and his foreign policy, and the fervent love of truth which have made him a household name from Siberia to Ceylon. No monarch of India has exerted such influence on the history of the world by his zeal for righteousness and virtue. That's an interesting way to see it, right? So he's not couching this in the way that a lot of the Europeans were talking about Ashoka. Yes, of course, he has a big army, but it's more important to think about this as his. So that, I think, gives us a barometer of, or a sense of where Dutt is coming from. Of course, he died in 1909 before some of the really got going, the modern nationalist movement really got going. And yet he contributed to it a lot just by his writings. Now, this is not, as I told you, this is not directly relatable to eco-criticism yet, but it is part of the larger context in which people like Bankim Chandra and Desrosiers and others, Desrosiers was a little earlier, but this sort of sense of forging a new nation. And what should we be proud of in this idea of new nation? I think finally today, if I'm not mistaken, so we're right on schedule. Tagore's The Religion of the Forest, right? In 1931, there are different versions of this, and I don't know if he, sometimes he translated his own work, right? And some people said maybe you shouldn't have, but because his Bengali is so brilliant. But anyway, extracts from an anthology published in 1997, simply called Rabindranath Tagore, an anthology edited by Krishna Dutt and Andrew Robinson. So they note that although Bankim was the first novelist in India, Rabindranath remains the only novelist in Bengali to have been widely read by non-Indians back then, right? So if you're a new nation, it's not, you have to, on the one hand, speak to your people, but on the other hand, you want to, as Nehru said, enter the comity of nations, right? Because that's also the sense of the modern, is to say, where do we fit in, right? If you go back to, say, China, the way it famously shut its doors in the late 1400s, after amazing ships and conquests, they suddenly said, nope, we can't, Japan did that for a time. We cannot be sort of infected by the rest of the world. But in the modern sense, there's a realization you can't exist alone, unless maybe you're Trump. Sorry. You can't exist alone, so I shouldn't put that in. But unless you recognize that you are in conversation with other countries. And we know that the Indian and nationalist movement had so much contact with the Irish, for example, right? Which is why, of course, I'd forgotten this, why Achebe uses Things Fall Apart from The Second Coming by Yeats. So back to this, it says, here's a quote, "If there be any truth absolutely unrelated to humanity, then for us it is absolutely non-existing." This is from an imagined conversation with Einstein, all right? So if there be any truth absolutely unrelated to humanity, maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, what does it matter to us, right? We're concerned. That's what he said. On Bankim, he said, of course, the chief glory of Bankim is that he ushered in an age in which Bengalis felt pleased and proud to speak and write in their own tongue. On Kalidasa, he says, so he's wide-ranging in his consciousness of, and remember, people outside the country are reading Tagore, right? On Kalidasa, he says, his mind was oppressed by material things while living in the city of Ujjain, and there he let his thoughts escape to the vision of Tapovana and into life, light, and freedom. On Kabir, it is nonetheless true that most of our great saints of that time who took up this cry in their life and teachings and songs came from the lower classes. So subaltern, one of them being the Muslim weaver Kabir, one a cobbler, and several coming from ranks of society whose touch would pollute the drinking water of the respectable section of Hindus, and thus the living voice of India ever found its medium even in the darkest days of our downfall. Very modern sensibility, right? Sort of trying to reach a broad India, also very conscious of their place. Again, I'm saying perhaps the obvious here, but anyway, I'll just conclude here with a few more thoughts, and I'll get to the forest now. He says, I love India not because I cultivate the idolatry of geography, but because I have had the chance to be born in her soil, not because I have had the chance to be born in her soil, but because she has saved through tumultuous ages the living words that have issued from the illuminated consciousness of her great sons. Interesting, right? Very Tagorean, sort of almost mystic. He was a kind of a mystic in some ways. So what about the forest? What about Mother India, right? Tagore's meditations on the ethos of the forest in India's deep cultural history point to an issue that has preoccupied some Indian historians, including the subaltern studies collectives Ranjit Guha and Dipesh Chakrabarti, as we know, which is the degree to which historical studies should draw on literature, especially poetry, to help convey the ethos of particular times. As I don't know if you've read Provincializing Europe, but which is Chakrabarti's great book from maybe a couple decades ago. But it's interesting how much he turns to poetry to make his points. So that a lot of historians are now turning to literature to try to get a sense of that ineffable aspect of the ordinary people's response. And I would say, more for our interest, the response to the natural world, right? That's something that no empirical account will satisfy. Roshinkata Chaudhary, again, in a different essay called The Flute, Durantian, and Subaltern Misreadings of Tagore, which is a fascinating essay, she quotes a 1941 conversation Tagore had on this topic with younger writers. I hope this is worthwhile as we conclude this section on Tagore. So he's advocating the sense of the forest more as a kind of sensibility than necessarily a material forest. Yes, he does talk about actual plants, trees, in his autobiography, for example. But here he's trying, because not everyone has access to the forest, right? I mean, Rajasthan, parts of it don't have forests. So you can't just say, oh, everyone should go to the forest, right? So what is the ethos? And I think that's what she's trying to get at. So here's the section. Pundits judge the merits and demerits of literature, but you have brought together the joy of pure enjoyment. On one side, there is flavor, rasa, and on the other side, enjoyment. If pedantry or panditya is brought between these, then that makes a different form, rup. Its field is different. He had complained elsewhere, writes Roshinkata Chaudhary, similarly, that in our country we call the display of book learning criticism. I don't agree. On the one side, there is the thing to be appreciated or tasted, and on the other side, the one who enjoys. When these two meet, then that is criticism. Whether the thing is Mughal or Pathan, feudal or capitalist, there is no point in looking for that. It is full of rasa. You have liked it. Speak of these things properly. Don't bring pedantry. The occasion for this was criticism of Tagore by people like Ranjit Guha. This is later criticism, that the practice of history had become stultified by factuality, right? And that history writing therefore needs a kind of poetic outlook that Tagore represented. Chaudhary shows that Guha misread this, and he recognizes that Tagore is upset with these literary critics. But Tagore, she observed, and this is, I'm going to conclude with these couple of points, was actually criticizing literary critics for accusing him of political disengagement and elitist sentiment. That's a common challenge. So we have a lot of criticism, especially by Marxists. That's the thrust of a lot of post-colonial critique. Also subaltern studies, a lot of Marxist, which is great. I'm just neutral observation, is that that tends to say that literature is in the service of something great else. In other words, that literature has to be politically attuned, right? But as I tell my students, there's no prescription for literature, what literature has to do. Literature has to do with sentiments. And so he was reacting, rightly so. He was annoyed that the literary critics were dismissing him for being elitist and rarefied, right? So this is the danger or the challenge that we meet. So, one last minute here. So I think this is worth thinking about for all, that's why I mentioned these. This is worth thinking about for everything we do. You folks as students, but also teachers. Criticism of seemingly apolitical or overly aestheticized writing is understandable to a degree. These are my words. Given that numerous tyrants in the past have coveted artistic works, from Roman emperors to Mussolini, right? I mean, you can be the worst dictator and love art, right? So there's an understandable skepticism of that. I agree with Chaudhary, however, that art should never be prescriptive, that by definition, great art depends on creative freedom. No wonder even seemingly benign literary works have been censored by rulers. across the globe. There's a big, in the US now, all these, um, you can't censor publishing things, but the parents of school libraries are all trying to stop all these really very benign novels, right? It's become crazy. So um, Chaudhary reminds us that it is not only the novel that narrates the nation, because that's a big argument in post-colonial, noting that Bengali poetry, in fact, led Bengal's independence movement in the early 1900s, not the novel. Although we have Bankim's 1882 novel, but poetry did. The lesson for us, I think, is not to read literature for its instrumental value, but instead for its aesthetic ethos, for the aesthetic ethos it conveys to readers who may thereby more clearly apprehend the reality of the subject matter. That's the other. Remember, I said at the start of this talk, language is not transparent. These literary critics in the 1930s who were criticizing Tagore in the 1940s, in the thick of the, understandably, we have to remember their times, anti-British nationalism, were saying, you have to be more political active, right? You can understand that. But he says that if you say that, then you're saying that art is sort of a footnote to history. Does that make sense? Whereas, I mean, maybe art is life. You know, I mean, what is it we're fighting for? Right? You establish a nation, then what? Right? Is it just to have a border, an army, things like that? So this does not mean that we should perform only close readings divorced from everyday affairs. Of course, I love history. I use a lot of interdisciplinary work. Obvious bigotry is unforgivable. What this does mean, as Chaudhary advocates, is that we must be open to great writing's invitation to examine our own ethical responses to the world, whether or not these accord with those of the narrator or the characters. And I'll stop there. Thank you.